Hello, it's me again, Sayus. Again is a little bit of a strong word, I guess. I haven't actually done much recently. Part of that is that I actually had a lot of stress during the last few weeks, and I will have more so in the coming weeks. So I kind of noticed that all these videos are a lot of work, so I'm trying to try different things. So for now, this is the new format, which is talking MHA while drawing stuff or while learning how to draw. So don't expect much. I just need something to happen in the video while I talk. Enjoy, I guess. So this video is what other thing to talk about? Endeavor and the Todoroki family. We are at chapters 300, 301, and 302. Three amazing chapters all about the Todoroki family. And I actually told myself I didn't want to make 100 videos about Endeavor. But now I'm 3 videos in and my third video is about Endeavor again, primarily. Not just about him, I also want to talk about the other members of the family, most specifically Toya. I don't have time to talk about every single one of them, because as you know me, I tend to ramble about the things I want to talk about. So to keep the video a bit shorter, I will just talk about Toya and Endeavor, and a little bit about fan discussions, because recently with these 3 chapters, there are a few things happening in the fandom that I want to address. So first, I think it's important to talk about the flashbacks that we've now seen regarding the Todoroki family, where we get a little bit of understanding as to what happened in the past. To just quickly summarize it, we now know that the marriage between Rei and Angie was arranged between Angie and Rei's parents, and that Rei agreed to it. We know that after Toya's quirk started turning against him and hurting him, Endeavor stopped the training immediately, but Toya wasn't very happy with that because Toya was determined to defeat All Might and be the masterpiece, essentially, that Endeavor had hoped for. We know that Endeavor wanted Toya to stop because he worried very much about Toya being hurt. He then got Natsuo and Shoto, both in an attempt to finally get the child that has both the Ice and Fire quirk, and in an attempt to to basically force Toya to stop trying to catch up to All Might by showing him a kid that could actually do it. We know this backfired massively. Toya actually attacked Shoto. After this, Enji kept away from Toya completely. He also kept away from the other 2 children, which I assume is more so by association rather than because he actually wanted to stay away from them. It seems like he was staying away from Toya, and because he was staying away from Toya, he also stayed away from Fuyumi and Natsuo. We know that Toya, despite this, wanted to still prove to Enji that he could be the masterpiece kid, essentially, the golden child, and try not by himself until he found out that his quirk got stronger and his flames turned blue when he was emotional, and then asking his dad to come watch him on Circuito Mountain so he could see what he had learned. Endeavor never came, and in the ensuing emotional moment, Toya accidentally burned himself to death. We don't really know how he survived this yet, but we do know that it was accidentally, apparently, and that it happened after Endeavor didn't come to watch him in Circuito Mountain. So that leaves me with 3 things I want to talk about. One is Endeavor, the other is Toya, and last is, as I mentioned, fan discussions. I can't talk about everything because there's so much to talk about just with any of these characters because they're getting more and more complex. So the first thing I want to talk about is with Angie specifically, but also with Rei to a lesser degree, the difference between Angie as an abuser and Angie as a bad parent. Because in this flashback, we are treading this very thin line where Endeavor is right between the 2 things, and also both things at once. And I make this distinction because it's clear that, of course, an abusive parent is always a bad parent, and a bad parent can always also be abusive. I make this distinction more so to kind of differentiate between let's say, the levels of evil, or the intent behind the abuse. Because when we look at how he treated Shoto in Shoto's flashbacks that we've seen in Sports Festival and ever since, this is clearly overt abuse where no matter how you look at it, no matter how you slice it and dice it, there's little to kind of excuse it. There's no excuse to it whatsoever, but there's also no way to think maybe he thought it was for the best. There's no way to answer this question with a yes, he did. No, Enji clearly did abuse Shoto. It is very overt. It is very much, no questions asked. This is very clear abuse. And it is very much so clear abuse that if you put yourself into Enji's shoes, there is no way how to justify it to himself. Right? And I think he himself is clearly, I think, aware of it now. He might not have been aware of it then. I do think that he very much had this tunnel perspective where he didn't see it. But if he had just one moment stopped and thought about what he was doing to Shoto, I think he would have realized that this is clearly abuse. With Toya, it's different in regard, he's still abusing Toya, but I don't think he is doing it in the same egocentrical way that he is with Shoto. Because with Toya, it seems to be he is very much trying to find a way to help Toya, and he's screwing up in the worst way possible, because first he is neglecting his son's psychological needs. His son as a child would have clearly needed therapy, and he clearly didn't get that, apparently. So that is a form of neglect, because he doesn't provide what his son needs. And then later on, when it became too difficult for him to talk to Toya, and also when he started believing that him being close to Toya would only make things worse, he completely ignored Toya. So then we have emotional neglect, because he doesn't even talk to his son anymore. He doesn't even look at him anymore. He doesn't spend time with him, and apparently he even makes extra amounts of work just to not have to deal with Toya. So we kind of started to believe that maybe his crazy record of having like the most solved cases in Japan is just because he has been trying to avoid Toya for like 10 years almost, 5 years. I think, 5 years pretty much. And the difference is with Shoto and Toya, that with Toya, while there is abuse, there is clear like better intent. He's trying to help his son. He's very twisted in how he does it, and he goes absolutely the wrong way, and it ends up in abusing his son. But he's doing it in this weird way where he's justifying it to himself that he is saving his son, or he's trying to save his son. And of course it didn't go right. But I think because the trajectory, the intentions are so different, I like to differentiate it from the abuse that Shoto suffers. Now, this doesn't mean that what Toya suffers is any better or worse. It's still abuse. It's just that I like to make this distinction, because if I look at actual parents in real life, it makes to me a very distinct difference whether a parent is just failing at being a parent despite trying their best, or whether they are actively, overtly, and intentionally abusive. I think that there's a difference there. And with Toya and with Enji and Rei when they were younger, it seems to be, for me, a clear case of two young parents overwhelmed with raising the child that they have. And it makes perfect sense, and that's part of why I love this new information so much, because now that we think about it, it makes perfect sense that Rei and Endeavor have no idea how to raise a child. Rei and Endeavor at this point are apparently, we don't really know how old Rei is, but Endeavor was 22 when Toya was born. So, very young parent. They're of course younger teenage parents, but 22 is still young to have your first child. On top of that, he's somebody who is basically married to his work. He also doesn't really know the woman that he has a child with. It's Rei and Endeavor apparently met when they were like 21, I would assume. They married very soon after, and then it wouldn't have taken too long for Rei to get pregnant. So at best it seems like Rei and Enji knew each other for maybe a year or a year and a half before Toya was born. So this is all going very quickly, and you can't raise a child with somebody you don't really know. On top of that, neither Rei nor Enji really wanted children in terms of having children. I think Rei wants a family, But she also seemed to go along with Endeavor's wishes. And Enji clearly doesn't want a child; he wants a successor, heir, somebody who can defeat All Might. So he has very clear ideas of the kind of child that he wants, and he doesn't want the child for the sake of the child, but for the sake of his own idea of who the kid will turn out to be once the kid is an adult. And with these kind of parameters in the beginning, it's no surprise whatsoever that when they then have a child, and when that child is a little bit more difficult than the average child to handle, in the sense that Toya seemed to have self-harming tendencies, very little regard for his own well-being. He has a problematic quirk that is not just dangerous for others, but also dangerous for himself. He has inherited Endeavor's anger, obsession, and stubbornness, which is all problematic. And he also seemed to have violent tendencies that we can see break out with Shoto. I wouldn't go the route where I say that Toya was born a psycho or born evil, which I've seen some fans say that. I don't think that's the case, but I do think that he was born a little bit of a difficult kid, and that would be normally perfectly fine if you have parents that, I don't know, maybe read a How to Parent book, but I'm not actually certain that between Rei and Enji they read a single How to Parent book, because Enji didn't really want the kid. He wanted somebody who would grow up into being a successor, and he would be, I think for him it would be the best if the kid would have just come out fully formed and already an adult, which of course doesn't happen. And Rei, I'm not sure if she had any ideas beyond just agreeing with whatever Enji was doing. And the reason I love this so much is because it feels real. It feels like two parents who are kind of young, who have a child, who are unprepared for it, or who have a child because they think having a child is maybe cute, or who have a child because they have expectations, and the child just doesn't turn out the way you want it to turn out. And it's quite clear with both Rei and Toya, I think, cared for Rei and Enji cared for Toya. Especially Enji, I'm particularly certain that Toya is his favorite child. I still am convinced of that. So I don't doubt for a second that both Rei and Enji loved Toya when he was born and when he grew up. But they also didn't know how to handle him at all. And that just feels very real. And it feels much more real than the comically evil Endeavor that we see in that is introduced to us in Sports Festival when Shoto first talks about Endeavor. And it's also much different from a lot of fan versions of Endeavor that are circulating through the internet. And I love it because it's so much more real and it's so much more nuanced and believable. Now, I mentioned the intentions, which is the main difference between how he treats Shoto and how he treats Toya. And when I say this, I don't mean that Toya's abuse is somehow better or worse because the intentions are different, but I do think we have to look at the whole situation in a different perspective, depending on these intentions. Because I think for the family overall, it makes a massive difference whether somebody intentionally abuses them or whether somebody's trying their best to be a decent parent and just very much failing. Of course, the outcome might be the same in terms of abusing Toya, and Toya clearly hates Endeavor most of all of his siblings. But in terms of the whole family dynamic, this has to be viewed as different. So what are the intentions that we're talking about? There's first the primary intentions that he had from the very start, which is to have a child that can surpass All Might, or more originally to surpass All Might himself, which then got twisted into having a child that can surpass All Might. Then secondly, as soon as Toya was born, the intention is to keep Toya safe or to save Toya. That's something I think we can see very early on, that Endeavor clearly loved Toya. I'm fairly convinced that Toya is his favorite child and still remains his favorite child all the way until he's dead, until he's presumed death. And we can see that in chapter 291 when Endeavor was first talking about Toya, which is clearly with love and care, and this idea that Toya is the one who might have been able to change his ugly heart, and that he already mellowed down, and it wasn't even that important anymore if he can't surpass All Might. So Toya, he definitely cared about Toya. But more than that, we can see how the entire Todoroki family after Toya was created for Toya. So the other three children, Fuyumi, Natsuo, and Shoto, were all born to some degree for Toya. We can see it with Fuyumi because after Toya's birth, Toya was like supposed to be the successor, even when later on it turned out Toya doesn't actually have the quirk that Enji hoped he has. He still went along training him and hoping that Endeavor could fulfill this role until much later on when he was 5, 6, 7 years old, and it turned out that the quirk actually damages him and he had to stop the training. But even when he first found out that Toya only has the fire quirk, Endeavor wanted to train him and saw him as the successor. And if you remember that when Fuyumi was born, Ray said that they should have children to support each other. And in Endeavor's mind, it kind of translates to, we have children, more siblings, to support the masterpiece, to support the successor. So Fuyumi was born for Toya in that mindset. She was born to support Toya and to make it easier for Toya to become this number one hero that he was supposed to become. Then later on, Natsuo and Shoto were born to save Toya from his own obsession. Of course, not just that, they were also born to defeat All Might. Natsuo fulfills neither of these two purposes. So in Enji's eyes, he would be a complete failure, even though I am now partly convinced that Enji probably didn't call him a failure, but this explains why Enji never spent much time with Natsuo, because he was very much focused on saving Toya and on training Shoto, and Natsuo couldn't do either, so Natsuo just fell to the wayside. With Shoto, of course, Shoto was then supposed to fulfill both, but he doesn't fulfill the saving Toya part, he only fulfills the quirk part, having the perfect quirk. He's probably not going to surpass All Might. I mean, All Might is now retired, so he doesn't fulfill that purpose either. But at the moment of his birth, he was supposed to A, surpass All Might, and B, save Toya. And already, few months after his birth, he failed at saving Toya, because Toya got even worse after Shoto's birth, because he saw that he was being replaced. So I've seen a lot of people argue that Shoto is therefore born to save Toya, so it's a good intention behind Shoto's birth. I've seen other people argue that Shoto is primarily born to surpass All Might, so it's this bad intention. I think the answer is in between, and I do think that at this point in time, we can't actually separate the two intentions anymore, because in Enji's mind, they become one and the same. So I want to make a little bit of an experiment, not an experiment, but just imagine yourself into this situation. You are obsessed with defeating All Might. This is the reason you start the whole family. That was why Endeavor did what he did. Then, however, your son, your oldest son that you love, that you've pushed your ambitions on and then had to take the ambitions back because it turns out that they were hurting your son, but you love this child because it's your firstborn, it's your favorite child. And this child is hurting and killing himself over trying to surpass All Might. So at this point, I think it becomes perfectly understandable that the ambition to save Toya and the ambition to surpass All Might become one and the same. Not just in the sense that he hopes to have a child that will surpass All Might and therefore save Toya, but also in the sense that Endeavor's own obsession with All Might naturally increases because of Toya's obsession with All Might. So they're kind of stacking one on top of the other, because Endeavor is obsessed with All Might and Toya becomes obsessed with All Might. And Endeavor at this point was actually mellowing down. We see it in 291 when he says that Toya was slowly doing away with the ugliness in his heart and he was almost willing to be content with just these two children. It implies that he was mellowing down in his obsession over All Might. But then Toya becomes obsessed with All Might, and Toya is killing himself over All Might. So it's perfectly reasonable or understandable, even though it's very twisted and very wrong, and it just led to horrible consequences that then Enji becomes even more obsessed with All Might, because now his son is killing himself over All Might. And the more obsessed Endeavor becomes with All Might, of course, the more obsessed Toya becomes with All Might. It's like they're pushing each other to new heights of obsession with All Might. And I think if you actually look at it, it's all in Endeavor's mind. Like, I'm not particularly certain that Toya is really, really obsessed with All Might. Toya seems to really love his father, in terms really want to spend time with him. And in Toya's child mind, he's like 8, 13 later on. It's perfectly possible that the only reason he was obsessed with All Might was because he saw that his father was obsessed with All Might, and he thought that was how he could get his father's attention. So really, Toya was obsessed with his father, and not so much with All Might, which is also explained why Darby himself doesn't seem overly obsessed with All Might. Darby is definitely obsessed with Endeavor, but he doesn't seem overly obsessed with All Might. So I think the answer is that Toya's obsession with All Might is something that is more so in Enji's head. And if Enji actually thought about it really hard, he would probably see that Toya is just an 8-year-old, 10-year-old, 13-year-old kid who wants his father's attention, and thinks trying to surpass All Might and killing himself in the process is the best way to do that. So now that we're already talking about Toya, let's talk about Toya next, because although I could still say so much more about Endeavor, because there's so much in this flashback, I'm already talking about him for like 20 minutes, and now it's Toya's time. So one of the main things regarding Toya is something which I think in this fandom we have kind of ignored, or not talked about as much as we probably should in this whole fan discussion, and that is the question of the culpability of children. In this chapter it's quite prevalent, because now we have one side of the fandom who says Toya was an evil child from Satan, who had never had a chance at being a decent human person because he was a born psycho, which of course is absurd. And the other side arguing that Toya is a 13-year-old kid who, no matter what, can do no wrong, and everything he does is always somebody else's fault, namely his parents, who were the abusers. Which is also absurd, because yes, while a lot of what Toya does is his parents' fault, as with every child, a lot of what a child does is, to a degree, a parent's fault because they raised them wrong. With 13 years old, even as the victim of abuse, you are to a degree culpable for your own actions, at least in the eyes of morality, not necessarily in the eyes of the law, depending on where you are. And I think this is something which is very interesting, because it's a new opinion. I have not yet seen in this fandom anybody say that this is a kid, he can do no wrong. Especially with different examples from the past, I've actually seen quite the opposite, and that is, for example, Bakugo, who also is a kid, who also was a bully, and we see Toya in this chapter starting to become a bully with his mom, for example, or gaslighting Natsu, although I don't think he quite understood that completely. With Bakugo, we never ask the question of whether as a child he is fully responsible for his bullying. That is something which, not just in the MHA fandom, but overall in most fandoms, bullies are fully responsible for their action. We just expect them to be able to understand that what they're doing is wrong. And we just assume that they are horrible people for being bullies. Of course, that's also absurd, because a 15-year-old kid and a 14-year-old kid, and we even see Bakugo as like a 6 or 7-year-old kid being a bully. While yes, they do have an understanding of the evil they are doing and the injustice they are doing and committing to a kid, to a degree at least, to Deku in Bakugo's example, they are still children and don't have full culpability. Yet, for whatever reason, when it's about school bullying, we just assume that children should have that. And I've seen people argue that because Bakugo was a school bully, he can basically not be forgiven. There is no way anything he did so far is enough to forgive what he did or to look past what he did, even though he was a child during anything of what he did. There are people who would say that as long as he hasn't actually begged for Deku's forgiveness on his knees, and as long as he hasn't seen serious consequences like being expelled or being seriously punished, so long they won't forgive anything what he did, even though he is a child. So the idea that because he is a 13-year-old kid, therefore he can do no wrong and everything he does is the parents' fault, is of course something that in this fandom is suddenly coming out of nowhere. The only reason it is here, of course, is because A, Toya is not a school bully. Instead, his actions are turned against his family. B, Toya, we know for a fact, is the victim of neglect, so of abuse. And of course, both A and B are actually kind of problematic examples, especially if we compare it to school bullies not receiving the same leeway in how we judge their actions. That is, a school bully, no matter what, is always 100% to blame. Bakugo, no matter what, always 100% to blame for his actions. I've never seen anybody say anything else. Of course, it shouldn't make a difference whether you're bullying somebody in school or whether you're bullying your own family. That shouldn't make a difference. Shoto was a young baby, not at fault, completely innocent. Toya shouldn't have done what he did, and this is not better or worse because it's not done in school. Same thing, his mother has been abusing him in the past. Of course, she has also been neglective. But Toya does turn from the abused to the abuser in this case. The same thing we can see with many bullies, and that is many bullies are bullied at home. So in this case, it's also a case of the abused becoming the abuser, from being bullied at home to becoming a bully in school. So we also have with both of these cases, clear cases where we have victims of abuse. Being a victim of abuse is, for the most part, not an excuse for being a bully. A bully is a bully whether they are abused or not, and for the most part we assume that if they are bullying in school, even if they are the victim of abuse, they are still wrong for their actions, and they are still to blame for their actions despite the abuse, and somebody has to teach them, of course, that they should act differently. That's, I think, something that in the real world we mostly understand, even though we not always act upon that. In this fandom we don't act upon that, and that is Bakugo is always abusive. That Bakugo is always the bully. Bakugo is always the idiot. I've seen so many people argue that Bakugo, no matter what, can't make up for what he did. The Bakugo, as long as he didn't grovel on his knees in front of Deku, asking for his forgiveness and apologizing in tears, as long as he didn't see any real consequences for his actions, as long as he didn't get expelled from school and didn't get punished severely, as long as none of that happened, there's no understanding for Bakugo whatsoever, and there's no understanding of him being a better character, because as long as he hasn't seen consequence and as long as he wasn't punished, we just assume that he hasn't changed, which of course is absurd. The fandom in this case treats Bakugo very harshly, I think. It also treats Mineta very harshly, who is another kid who, of course, is behaving like an idiot and is a pervert, but is also a kid. And yet when we look at Toya, we treat him exactly the opposite. We're like, yeah, he's 13 years old, he's not to blame, it's all its father's fault. The answer, I think, is somewhere in between. Yes, it is to a big degree his father's fault, but also he's a 13-year-old kid who, we actually see in this chapter, has an understanding of that what he did was wrong. He has an understanding of that. He's just not really acting upon it. So I don't really want to make a clear example as to where I think Toya stands. I think Toya has, as a child, some minor responsibility for his actions. His parents, of course, share the major part of the responsibility, but I think it is wrong to just excuse him from everything he does just based on, well, he's a kid. I think what this plays into is Adult Darby. And I think Adult Darby is still doing that, and that is Adult Darby is still shifting the blame, and this is the reason why I'm not a big Darby fan. I really like this kid Toya, I'm not a big Darby fan, because Darby still is shifting the blame, and I think this is the major difference between him and Endeavor, and that Endeavor realizes that he messed up. Darby doesn't. Darby is still reveling in the situation where he thinks his victims are actually Endeavor's victims, where he's thinking about when he died, and he thinks back to, well, this is Endeavor's fault, because Endeavor never taught me how to turn down my heat. He only taught me to turn up the heat. But really, if we look at it from the flashback that we saw, Endeavor barely even taught Toya how to turn up the heat. Toya taught himself how to turn up the heat. So in this case, these are the thoughts of adult Darby. Child Darby, 13-year-old Darby, I perfectly understand if 13-year-old Darby blames his father for what happened. But adult Darby should understand that Endeavor was not the person who taught him to turn up the heat. That was himself. That is something where a 24-year-old Darby should, in hindsight, be able to understand that, but he doesn't. He still blames his father for it. There are a lot of things he has every reason to blame his father for. But teaching him to turn up the heat is not really one of them, because at this point, Enji hasn't trained Toya for more than 5 years. And Toya has trained himself, and everything Toya knows at this point regarding his quirk and the blue flames and how strong he can get, these are all things that he taught to himself. So this is about roughly what I want to talk about regarding Toya. I have already talked a lot about fan perceptions, and I think I want to talk about 4 things quickly. First, I've seen a few people argue that this is Endeavor's redemption arc crumbling down because now he sees consequences, and he never saw them before. So now we see that all he did doesn't matter because the consequences now hit him in the face. I just want to say very shortly, I think people who say this are misunderstanding the redemption arc, and this is something which I've seen quite a lot of people do, not just people who hate Endeavor, but also Endeavor fans, and that is the idea that Endeavor's redemption arc is somehow supposed to be over, or that it will ever be over. I think a redemption arc is not supposed to end. I think, as far as Endeavor is concerned, his arc is about trying to be a better person while dealing with the consequences. And there will not be a time in this story where we can say, well, this concludes Endeavor's redemption arc. There will not be a time in this story where either the consequences show that all he did to better himself doesn't matter, nor will there be the moment where the consequences suddenly disappear. Endeavor's story is about having to live with the consequences. And it has been that since Pro Hero, so I'm kind of confused that this is still something that it gets that people disagree on because we don't see it. Endeavor's redemption arc didn't end with Pro Hero. I saw a lot of people argue that way back when Pro Hero happened. Endeavor's redemption arc didn't end with Endeavor Agency. I've seen again a lot of people argue that it ended with Endeavor Agency, and that we were now supposed to assume that he's a redeemed character. And Endeavor's redemption arc won't end here. The idea of a redemption arc is that it's something that doesn't end. I think the best way to describe it is that at the end of the day, when Endeavor inevitably dies, which can be within the scope of the story, which can be just like 5 chapters from now, which I don't hope, but it could be. But it could also be 20 years from now when the story is long over and he is now a retired grandpa and finally dies of blood pressure. I have no idea. When he dies, his family, his fans, everybody he knows, they would probably look at his grave and say, I don't know if you were an abuser or a hero. And I think this is Endeavor's story, that at the end of the day, he now has to live with what he did, and even at this final moment, whenever that will be, there will still be people who just see him as an abuser. And that's fine. I just wanted to mention that because I saw quite a few people argue that him facing the consequences is a proof that his redemption arc is failed. It's not. So the second thing regarding the fan discussions is the idea of the retconning, which is this idea that we're now backtracking on everything we knew about Endeavor before, and suddenly he's all nice and cuddly, when before he was comically evil. Of course, that's I don't think that's true. I actually was very surprised when I saw this opinion, which is kind of widespread, I think, because I myself wasn't that surprised with anything happening in the flashback, and with it I don't mean that I've predicted anything that happened in the flashback. Most of what happened in the flashback is new to me too, but I did expect Enji to be portrayed as a nuanced character in the flashback, because he was portrayed as a nuanced character ever since Kamino Ward. So why would we suddenly go back to comically evil? I spoke about this in my last video about Endeavor, that even in Sports Festival, when we first met Endeavor and when we first got a very evil impression of him, because of Shoto's explanations, he still wasn't comically evil in Sports Festival. So portraying him as comically evil here would not just be weird, because it would be contradicting all the nuance that we've seen from him already. But more than that, it would come out of nowhere, because Endeavor never was comically evil. Shoto portrayed him as such, and I think this is an important aspect that we have to see. Endeavor was first introduced to us from Shoto's perspective, which is the kid he abused the worst. And he still did that. None of his flashback denies anything that Shoto said about what Enji did to him. He still trained him harshly, starting at the age of 8. Shoto still witnessed Endeavor abusing his mother. In this flashback, we even get a few very direct scenes of abusing his mother. In the flashback during Sports Festival, there is one moment where he slaps Ray, but it's not even in the panel, and we only see it because of the sound that it makes. But in this chapter, we actually have two different scenes where, with baby Shoto in the room, one time he's sleeping, of course, but one time he's awake, and Ray on the ground. They are fighting. Enji and Ray are fighting. Enji was getting louder. There's one panel where in both panels he's looming over them in both scenes, and in one panel he's actually like being almost demonic in how he's yelling at Ray. So we get two clearly abusive scenes with Ray, which is more than we got during Sports Festival. He still abused him during training. He still isolated him from his children, from his siblings, and he still just had him for the sake of having this perfect quirk. So nothing Shoto said is wrong. We got a bit of nuance in terms of Enji's intentions and what he was actually planning to do. We got a bit of nuance in terms of where Enji came from, why he was doing what he was doing. But the things he did are still the same, the things he did to Shoto. But it's still important to see that the first thing we know about Enji is the opinion of the child he abused were said. And not just the child that he abused worst, but also the child that he abused worst in the worst state of mind. Because pre-Sports Festival and during Sports Festival, Shoto is Shoto at his angriest. So this is a very angry child that was very badly abused, talking about his abuser. Of course, it's a very bad portrayal. Later on, and this is something which has been going on with Endeavor ever since Sports Festival, every single time he appears, we get a little bit more nuance to what he's doing, even in Hosu. And in Pro Hero, for example, in Kamino Ward, we get short flashbacks of how Enji ended up where he is. In Pro Hero, we got the whole flower scene with Ray, which seems to suggest that there's a little bit more going on between these two, other than just he bought her for money and forced her to have 4 children. In their agency, we have Fuyumi specifically mention that Natsuo blames their father for Toya's death, but she also insinuates that this is actually not true, in the terms that Endeavor didn't actually kill Toya. So Endeavor has been a nuanced character ever since he was introduced, almost. I'm really surprised that now that he's portrayed as a nuanced character in the flashbacks, this is suddenly weird. Endeavor didn't become a nuanced character because he realized that he was doing wrong. Endeavor was a nuanced character from the start. When he realized that he was doing wrong after All Might retired, he just changed his trajectory finally. He just finally realized that what he was doing was wrong. Next thing I want to talk about is the villain bias. It's just something I want to quickly mention, and something I'm kind of annoyed with. I don't think the villains will win. The villains are not right. The villains are blaming other people for their own actions. They are shifting their blames. The villains exist to show that the society as it exists. And I think Toya in this case is, of all of them, the most the victim of hero society, probably. They show that there are victims to society that are just ignored, that fall through the crack, and there are things that have to be done. There is not a scenario in this story where the villains win, where we can save the villains and they won't have to go to prison. I agree that I'm not of the opinion that the heroes will go and kill the villains. I don't think that will happen. Some villains may die, of course. Some heroes may kill some other villains. I'm not sure if Shigaraki will survive. But I do think that there are possibilities for certain of these villains to go to be captured instead of killed, and then to go to prison, and then maybe in prison to kind of be rehabilitated or something like that. There is, however, no scenario where we're kind of forgetting about all the murder that they committed and forgiving their sins, and everybody can live hunky-dory, and we're saving these villains in the way of we're not letting them go to prison. I don't think saving the villains means they don't have to go to prison. I think saving the villains, whenever that's said, means they will see consequences for what they did, but their life will not end with that. You know, prison isn't the end of the world at the end of the day. Lastly, just my quick complaint with fan discussions overall, which is, I've already kind of hinted at it, that I was really annoyed at the all or nothing debate regarding Toya. Either he's born evil or he's a 13-year-old kid who can do no wrong and there's no nuance in between. But also with, for example, the villains, where either we think the heroes will save them or we think they will somehow be redeemed and then team up with the hero. None of these things, I think, are options for most of these villains. For some, maybe. Of course, some villains will die, and maybe one or two villains will change sides. But overall, the answer's in between. And I think overall in fan discussions, when we're talking about the details, like will Shigaraki die or go to prison? Will Dabi die, go to prison, or be saved? Or run free? Is Dabi born evil or can do no wrong? But also in regards to the broader fan discussions, as in, do I love my hero or do I hate my hero? I think we should... I don't think that's healthy discussion. I'm sorry. And that's just something I wanted to mention, and I thought this was fitting because it was something I've really noticed in the whole Endeavor and Toya discussions. With both characters, there's a lot of all or nothing mentality going on, and I really think we should meet in the middle. So, now that I said that, I think I'm done with this video. Thank you for watching. Leave your opinions in the comments, and what was your favorite part about these two flashback chapters, which were two amazing chapters. Probably these last three chapters, my favorite stretch of chapters in the show so far. And tell me what you thought about them.